No one expected that a single name printed on a plane ticket would soon topple an entire industrial empire like falling dominoes, and even fewer expected that the woman's very first quiet inhale would mark the moment the world began to shift. Morning at San Francisco International Airport opened with cold winds cutting through the massive glass panels, yet beneath Dr. Madison Cole's feet, the ground seemed to tremble ever so slightly. Sunlight spilled across the floor, stretching the shadow of a 42-year-old CEO, a woman who had devoted her life to designing a sustainable future for the planet. But what none of the passengers brushing past her realized was that within a few hours, one decision she made would expose a powerful man who had buried a cruel truth for many years. Standing amid a rushing sea of travelers, her grey suitcase gliding behind her, Madison felt her heart expand with the familiar weight of responsibility and hope. Her speech at the World Climate Summit was not just a report, it was the key to unlocking a new era of ecological technology, the kind that could save lands rotting from poisoned water. Yet behind that polished professionalism, she carried a very human fear. The fear that the world might not be ready to face the truth, and that those who thrived in the shadows would not stand idle as she tried to illuminate them. Her mother's words echoed in her mind. You do not need to shout to change the world, you only need to stand firm. Madison allowed herself a small smile, tilting toward the beam of sunlight pouring through the airport dome, as if she were stepping across an invisible threshold between an old life and a startling new chapter. The first-class cabin of the Nordic air flight appeared like an oasis of cold luxury. The scent of new leather, the rattle of rolling luggage, the polite greetings of people accustomed to being prioritized, blended into a familiar symphony of entitlement. But as Madison stepped into that space, her breathing slowed, not because of its beauty, but because of the feeling rising inside her, a forecast. It was the instinct of a woman who had spent more than 20 years navigating a world full of measuring eyes, from board meetings to billion-dollar signings, to rooms where people looked at her as though she were merely borrowing the position she held. Seat 2. Her 8-hour sanctuary. The ticket in her hand was like a letter of confirmation. You belong here. Yet the moment she saw the seat from afar, her heart tightened, not because of the chair itself, but because she recognized a very familiar act, the taking of space. Not just taking a seat, but taking room, taking power, taking the peace she had earned with thousands of hours of work, millions of dollars in contracts, and decades of fighting to be respected as an equal in a world where certain men believed authority was their birthright. But this was only the first thin warning. The storm was waiting just beyond the door. Other passengers continued arranging their belongings, reading newspapers, slipping on headphones, believing everything was calm and pre-designed. But within that orderly flow, only Madison sensed the irregular heartbeat of fate, as if the universe were holding its breath, waiting for the moment to crack open. She touched the edge of her suitcase, the cold metal sharpening her focus. In 8 hours, the world would listen to her speak about truth, about science, about the future of waters that had been poisoned for decades. But in only 8 minutes, she would have to speak entirely different words, the opening line of a battle she never knew she had entered. Strangely, in that exact moment, Madison felt a profound stillness. Not the stillness of surrender, but the stillness of someone who understands that if something is about to happen, it is because she is in the right place at the right time. So with a long, steady breath, Madison stepped toward seat 2, unaware that this small motion would be the first brush of wings capable of shaking an empire. And then, so softly, it felt like a whisper, her intuition murmured, "You are about to change everything." But Madison did not know that the man sitting in seat 2A had been waiting to destroy her for a very long time, though he had no idea who the woman was that he was about to insult. And the story, like every great explosion, began with a very small silence. Madison stepped toward seat 2A, and in that moment, the world seemed to shrink into a single point, the man sitting where she rightfully belonged. He lounged back with smug ease, one leg crossed over the other, as if the cabin were his living room, his phone pressed to his ear, his voice booming through the refined quiet of first class. "No, I already told you," he growled, each word, thrown like a stone into the stillness. "Push the timeline. If they refuse, cut the contract. I do not tolerate incompetence." His tone carried the residue of power accustomed to obedience. Madison had no idea who he was, but she needed only a few sentences to recognize the kind of man who believed the world existed to serve him. When he ended the call, Madison offered a polite smile and said gently, "Excuse me, sir. This is my seat." And in that fragile instant, the temperature of the entire cabin dropped. The man lifted his gaze, pale grey eyes sweeping over Madison, not to see her but to evaluate her, to rank her, to dismiss her. It was a look she had endured countless times before, the look of someone who believed they had the authority to decide whether she deserved to exist in the same room. Then a cold smirk appeared, thin and cutting. "I do not think so, young lady," he replied, his voice dripping with a soft condescension that was far more dangerous than shouting. "I am quite comfortable here. You can choose another seat." So simple, so casual, yet potent enough to ignite a war. The cabin fell into a sudden hush. Madison kept her calm smile, but inside her a boundary sparked into existence. This was no longer about seat 2A. This was about respect. This was about dignity. She raised her ticket, her voice steady. "This seat is mine, sir. 2A, printed clearly." He glanced at the ticket for less than a second, then flicked his hand dismissively, as if brushing away a mosquito. "My ticket says 4D, but I prefer this one. The seat next to me is empty. Go sit there. It is a small matter." And in that moment, a familiar sound echoed inside Madison, the quiet click of a door locking. She had heard that phrase, "it is a small matter," her entire life. Every time someone wanted her to surrender what was hers, they wrapped their request in false ease. But that ease was always a velvet sheath hiding a blade. A young flight attendant approached Lily Adams, her brown eyes still innocent, her voice trembling slightly under the tension in the air. "Is everything all right?" Lily asked, glancing between Madison and the man. "There is—" He cut in sharply, pointing at Madison, as if she were a troublesome student. "She is making a fuss over a seat. I just want the window. She can sit over there. Help me resolve this." Lily's confusion flickered. Then instinct kicked in, the instinct of a young attendant taught to choose the path of least conflict. "Miss Cole," Lily said softly, "the seat beside his is also first class, and we are not completely full today. If you would just switch." Madison raised her hand, gentle but firm enough to halt Lily's words mid-air. Her voice lowered to a calm stillness, so profound it seemed to pull the cabin inward. "No, Lily. The issue is not the switch. Airline policy requires passengers to sit in their assigned seats. I paid for this seat, I selected this seat, and I will sit in this seat." A wave of silence swept through first class. Then, like a spark catching wind, the man laughed, low and poisonous. "Oh, please," he scoffed. "I have met all kinds of people, but someone, this stubborn over pride." That sentence never finished because Madison met his eyes, not with anger, not with fear, but with a blade, sharp stillness. "My name is Dr. Madison Cole, and you will not speak to me in that tone." Several passengers inhaled sharply. An older man in seat 1C lowered his newspaper. A woman in 3B stifled a gasp. Everyone knew this was no longer a seating dispute. This was the moment a woman who had endured enough finally stood her ground. The man, Gerald Whitman, let his smirk collapse into a scowl edged with confusion. Unaccustomed to resistance, he erupted, "Who do you think you are? Someone like you." "Enough," Madison said, cutting through the air with only 2 words. Lily panicked slightly and turned to Gerald. "Sir, please return to your assigned seat." "When passengers book a specific, I am not going anywhere." Gerald roared his voice, shattering every unwritten rule of first-class conduct. "Upgrade me. Swap my seat with hers. If you want me to move, bring someone with real authority." Madison closed her eyes for a single breath, gathering every fragment of resolve she possessed. When she opened them, her gaze no longer belonged to someone being insulted. It belonged to someone who already knew she would win. Gerald had no idea he had just chosen the worst opponent of his life, and the cabin had no idea that within minutes Gerald's outburst would ground the entire flight trigger, an airline investigation, and drag an entire industrial conglomerate into scandal. But in that moment, everyone still believed they were watching a small argument. Only Madison knew this was a test she had spent her entire life preparing to pass. And she would not retreat. The man before her had no idea that in one more breath his fate would change forever. The real explosion was not Gerald's shouting, but the moment after when Madison continued standing tall and perfectly still, without a single tremor in her eyes. Her calm, her silence, that was far too steady, sliced through the cabin like a long cut from ceiling to floor. People are not afraid of an angry man's yell. They are afraid when the person they expected to back down does not retreat even half a step. Gerald felt that, and that was exactly what pushed him further out of control. "You are intentionally causing trouble," he roared, his voice cracking with fury. "I already said I will not move. If you want to sit here, you must make me want to stand up, and I do not want to." He folded his arms, leaning deeper into the seat, his eyes filled with challenge, as if declaring that the universe should rotate around his will. Madison did not respond immediately. She simply looked at Lily with an expression that did not blame, but awakened. Lily inhaled sharply, trying to regain courage, but the power imbalance between an older, forceful Gerald and a young attendant made her hands tremble. "Sir, you cannot. You have to." Lily stuttered, her voice fading. Gerald instantly seized on that weakness, advancing in a battle he believed he was dominating. "I do not have to listen to some child," he barked, pointing at Lily. "Bring the purser here. Bring someone with real authority. I will not move because of a woman who thinks she is special and a girl who thinks she has rights." The words cut like an invisible blade, striking 2 women at once. And the cabin knew it, because silence suddenly became too loud. A man in the front row raised an eyebrow. A woman across the aisle slowly closed her laptop. A teenager leaned forward to see through the gap in the seats. This was no longer a seating dispute. It was the moment people witnessed a man accustomed to power abusing it in the open. And in that silence, the purser appeared. Mark Evans, 48 years old, stepped out from the front of the cabin. His face seemed older than it had that morning, because one glance told him everything had gone too far. "Good morning," Mark said, his voice steady, but edged with firmness. I am the purser of this flight. What seems to be the issue here? Gerald shot his hand up immediately, like a commander giving orders. There is an issue. The issue is her. He pointed at Madison. She is delaying the flight because she refuses to give up her seat for me. Such a simple matter, but she insists on escalating it. Mark looked at Madison, and all she needed to do was show her ticket. 2A, clear print. Name, flight date, seat number, not a single detail out of place. Mark turned to Gerald. "Sir, your ticket." Gerald snatched it from his pocket and tossed it into Mark's hand with the arrogance of a man who believed he was always right. Mark looked at the ticket for no more than 3 seconds before stating, "Your seat is 4D." The cabin fell into silence again, but this time it was not ordinary silence. It was the silence that comes when the balance of power tilts sharply to one side, catching the tyrant off guard. "I know my seat is 4D. Gerald barked, clinging to the last scraps of control, but I prefer this one. So what 4D is not occupied is it me sitting here does not kill anyone. It is not about killing anyone." Madison said, her voice low, yet razor sharp. "It is about respect." Gerald let out a cold laugh, so contemptuous that the air in the cabin seemed to freeze. "Respect," he repeated. "Someone like you wants to lecture me about respect." A few sharp breaths sounded from the back. A woman whispered, "Did he just say the words? Someone like you." A man muttered through clenched teeth. "There is no fixing this guy." Mark cut in decisively. "Sir, your remarks are inappropriate. I am instructing you to return to seat 4D immediately. If you refuse, I will have to report this to the captain." Gerald shot up from the seat, face flushed red. "I am not going anywhere. I want to see what you dare to do to me. Bring the captain here. I will sue this entire airline. I am not the kind of passenger you people can just throw off." And that was the moment everything passed the point of return. On an aircraft, you do not need to scream or break anything. A single phrase, "I will not comply," is enough to trigger a safety crisis. Madison looked at Mark, and Mark looked back at her. Neither spoke. Neither needed to. They both knew exactly what came next. Mark walked to the control panel near the cabin door, lifted the interphone, and his voice grew heavier, slower, as if every word pulled the aircraft backward. "Captain Mark said we have a non-compliant passenger, refusing crew instructions. I recommend activating Code Bravo." A dry click echoed across the cabin, the sound of a switch. And a heartbeat later, the captain's voice, Ava Thompson, cut through the speakers, every word sharp like metal carving the air. "We will not be departing. The aircraft will return to the gate. Ground staff and airport security will board to handle the situation." A wave of shock rippled through the cabin. Several people gasped. Some cursed quietly. Others pleaded under their breath, "Please do not delay this flight." Gerald froze, disbelief flooding his face. What he screamed. "She caused the problem, and you are stopping the entire flight because of her." But now no one was looking at Madison anymore. Every gaze had shifted to Gerald, the only person causing chaos, the only person refusing to comply, the only person responsible for sending more than 300 people back to the gate. Madison said nothing. She did not have to. The truth had spoken for itself, and at that moment, through the cabin windows, the jet bridge began sliding back toward the aircraft, pressing against the door, like a cold metallic arm, preparing to pull Gerald out of a world where he had always believed himself untouchable. No one on that plane, knew that the person about to step on board would change everything. Gerald had no idea that in only a few minutes his life would veer into a direction he was completely unprepared for. And Madison, she simply stood there, breathing slow and deep like a warrior who had long learned to recognize storms from afar, knowing she had just stepped into the center of a battle greater than anything she had ever faced. No one knew that the moment the cabin door opened, when the heavy footsteps of the security team echoed down the aisle, it was not only the moment Gerald Whitman would face his first consequence, but also the moment fate would expose a truth far larger than a seating dispute. 2 airport security officers stepped inside badges, catching the light with a cold silver gleam, their faces stern, as if all too familiar with passengers who believed they stood above the law. The cabin fell so silent that even the faint rattle of seatbelt buckles seemed loud against the strained breaths of those watching. Gerald, still unable to grasp what was unfolding, charged forward with the instinct of a man accustomed to intimidation. "Finally you are here," he snapped, pointing straight at Madison. "She is the one causing trouble. Take her off the plane. I am the one being disturbed here." The words shot into the wall of silence and bounced back at him untouched because the officers did not look at Madison. They looked at Gerald. They looked directly at him, as though no one else existed in the cabin. And this was the moment when the air stretched tight enough to crack. "Sir, are you Gerald Whitman?" the lead officer asked, voice even but devoid of softness. Gerald's chest lifted as if expecting vindication. "Yes, that is me, and I want," he never finished. A small but powerful sound rolled through the cabin, the sound of a magazine closing. Seat 1B, the silver-haired man who had been quietly reading, stood up. No one had noticed him before. He had not boasted. He had not postured. He had simply observed. And that silence made the moment he rose feel thunderous. When he reached into his jacket and pulled out a black leather wallet, the entire cabin seemed to stop breathing. The moment he opened it, revealing a federal badge, the air shifted. "I am David Mercer," he said, his voice deep and sharp enough that even those who could not see the badge felt his authority. "Director of Transportation, Safety Enforcement, United States Department of Transportation." A woman dropped her phone. An elderly businessman whispered, "My God." Lily covered her mouth. Mark straightened instinctively. And Madison, who wasn't easily stunned, felt the weight of the moment settle over her. David Mercer looked at Gerald as if reviewing a case file, expressionless and without mercy. "I witnessed the entire incident," he said. "And officers, this passenger," he pointed at Gerald, "has violated at least 3 federal aviation safety codes, refusing to comply with crew instructions, obstructing departure procedures, and engaging in disruptive behavior that threatens overall safety." Gerald's face drained of color, but the reflexes of a man long protected by privilege compelled him to fight back. "You do not understand. I am the one being disrespected here." David cut him off with a voice sharp enough to slice steel. "Choose your next words carefully, because everything you have done here has already been documented, and anything you say now will worsen your situation." For the first time since the chaos began, Gerald fell silent. But David did not. He held Gerald's gaze and delivered the blow with precision. "Your actions may delay this flight, cause financial damage to the airline, and most importantly, compromise the safety of hundreds of passengers. Under federal law, refusing to comply with crew instructions is an offense that can result in significant fines or prosecution." Gerald stepped back slightly, not out of fear, but as though the floor had shifted beneath him. His control, the thing he believed was permanent, was crumbling like sand slipping through his fingers. The officers stepped forward. "Mr. Whitman, please gather your belongings and exit the aircraft." Gerald looked around, searching for support, searching for someone to defend him, searching for anyone who still believed he was the victim. But every gaze turned away. Some shook their heads with disgust. Others looked at him as the man who had ruined their flight. And some, especially the passengers of color, looked at him with a heavy silence, a silence too familiar with the kind of insult he had displayed. Gerald's hands trembled as he gathered his things, not from remorse, but from the realization that for the first time in his life, his power was useless. As he passed Madison, his eyes met hers, a mix of confusion, anger, and somewhere deep beneath a flicker of unconscious pleading. Madison returned the look she had reserved for countless people who tried to diminish her calm without hatred and without forgiveness. Gerald turned away, as if afraid that meeting her eyes any longer would shatter whatever remained of him. When he disappeared through the door, a wave of release swept through the cabin. One passenger clapped, then another, then an entire row. The applause was not for Gerald's downfall, but for a rare moment of justice in a world that often ignored small but essential truths. David Mercer looked at Madison with genuine respect. "You handled yourself with remarkable composure," he said. "Not everyone remains calm in a situation like this." Madison nodded slightly. "Thank you. But this is far from over." David frowned subtly, as if sensing a deeper layer beneath her words, but he did not oppress. He simply said, "I will file a full report. Passengers like him must be held accountable." Mark approached to apologize. Lily stood behind him, eyes red from the tension. Madison smiled kindly at the young attendant. "It is all right. You did the best you could." But when she finally sat down in seat 2, a truly hers at last, a cold shiver ran down her spine. Not because of the argument, but because of the name Gerald had uttered earlier on his phone. Whitman Industrial, a factory previously accused of PFAS dumping, a lawsuit recently reopened, a scientific report Redwood Biotech had just received, and Gerald Whitman, the man just escorted off the aircraft, was the vice president of that very corporation. Suddenly, the dispute over Seat 2A became the shadow of something far larger, deeper, more dangerous. Madison closed her eyes. Gerald had not just caused a scene. He might have been on this flight for a reason entirely different, and she understood with chilling clarity, as though someone had whispered it into her ear, her battle was only just beginning. The plane slipped back into an orderly stillness as the cabin door closed once more, the click of the electronic lock sounding like a period placed at the end of the chaos, yet, at the same time, a comma opening the beginning of something deeper and far more dangerous. Madison settled into her seat, 2A the seatbelt trembling slightly with the remnants of adrenaline still pulsing through her, but her mind had already moved on. It raced ahead, chasing the scattered clues that had flashed like ghostly sparks in the dark. Whitman. The name echoed in her head like a hammer striking hollow metal. It could not be coincidence. It could not be meaningless. Every instinct she possessed, instincts sharpened by decades of confronting corporations with limitless resources, pulled her in one direction. Gerald was not merely an obnoxious passenger. He might be the tip of something far more deliberate. She opened her tablet and revisited the notes from the project Redwood Diagnostics had taken on 16 weeks earlier. GeoWave Analytics, a small lab with a groundbreaking isotopic tracing technology capable of tracking PFAS waste in water back to the exact facility that released it. The North Haven case, a town trapped in a nightmare of toxic water for many years. The lawsuit had dragged on, but now it stood on the edge of a breakthrough. If the isotope tracing was completed, if the signatures matched Whitman Industrial, would no longer be able to deny anything. And the only person who possessed that technology, GeoWave's lead engineer, Dr. Aaron Pierce, was scheduled to fly from Chicago to Zurich tonight to present the data at the conference. A shiver like ice raced down Madison's spine. If she knew that, then certainly Gerald knew that. Gerald, who had shown his true nature the moment he lost control. Gerald, who only minutes earlier still believed he could intimidate her with the hollow authority he clung to. But what chilled her more was the question rising beneath it. Had Gerald boarded this flight by chance, or had he been sent? Was everything that happened not because of a seat, but because Gerald panicked the moment he recognized her? The woman capable of delivering the evidence that could destroy his company. The aircraft began its taxi. The cabin vibrated softly. The overhead lights shifted into a warm glow. But inside, Madison, a storm coiled tighter. She unlocked her phone, enabled international data, and sent an urgent message to the person she trusted most in the legal division, Daniel Brooks. Daniel, confirm something for me immediately. What lawsuit are we currently pursuing with Whitman Industrial, and what position does Gerald Whitman hold? In under 3 minutes, the 3 dots appeared. Daniel never slept before midnight, and he never delayed when something serious surfaced. Madison, the North Haven case. We have evidence that could end them if the isotope analysis confirms what we expect. And Gerald Whitman is the Vice President of Plant Operations. Madison pressed her palm against her forehead, feeling it go cold. Gerald was the one directly responsible for the contaminated water. Gerald was the one with the most to lose if the evidence came out. Gerald was the one mentioned in internal reports as willing to do whatever necessary to protect the company's interests. A man like that on the same flight as Madison and on the eve of the conference, that could not be coincidence. Not with his kind of power. She sent another message. Is Aaron Pierce safe? Where is he? Daniel replied almost instantly. En route to Zurich. I told him to stay alert. That did nothing to calm her. If anything, it made her heartbeat spike in increments of 8. She closed her eyes briefly, piecing the events together. Gerald had been removed from the aircraft. The public did not know. The airline had not yet filed the report, but if Gerald had been assigned a task, then his removal only forced someone else behind him into a corner. The vice president had fallen apart under pressure, but whoever stood above him had not. Madison's strategic instincts surged awake, sharp as a creature built from steel and survival. We have to strike first before they pivot, she thought. And that was when Captain Ava's voice filled the cabin. We are preparing for takeoff. Please fasten your seatbelt. The aircraft shook more forcefully this time, but Madison's thoughts shook harder. And then, like a whisper from fate, a new email appeared on her screen. It came from someone she never expected. Liam Foster, a new intern at Redwood, seated several rows behind her on the same flight. Dr. Cole, I recorded the entire incident with Gerald. If you need it as evidence against Whitman Industrial, I can send it. Madison opened the video. Gerald red-faced shouting at her, insulting her refusing to comply. His voice echoed through the cabin, every syllable sharp. Someone like you does not deserve to sit here. It was too perfect, too clear. Not only did it expose Gerald's character, it exposed the desperation of a man who was afraid. Afraid of the truth. afraid of her. A thought struck Madison with such force that she straightened in her seat. Gerald had not lost control because of the seat. He had lost control because he saw her, because she was the one he and the corrupt empire behind him needed to stop at any cost. As the plane lifted off the runway and soared into the darkness above the Pacific, Madison felt herself step into the first chapter of a much larger, much darker secret. She typed a final message to Daniel, 3 words: "We strike back." And in the dim cabin light, as the aircraft settled into its night mode, Madison understood with absolute clarity this battle was no longer about lawsuits, no longer about science, and certainly not about a seat in first class. This was a war between truth and those determined to choke it out, and this time she would not let them win. Never. As the plane broke through the thick layer of clouds and the cabin sank into the cool blue glow of night mode, Madison's mind lit up like a laboratory thrown into emergency alert. Outside the window, the ink-black sky stretched endlessly, but inside her, a silent war was taking shape. Every clue, every word, every flicker in Gerald's expression fell into place, like scattered puzzle pieces snapping together, revealing a picture so enormous it made her heartbeat rise in the quiet. Gerald Whitman was not a random hothead. He was the vice president of operations, the person who understood better than anyone what would happen if the PFAS isotope analysis became public. And he happened to be on the same flight as Madison Cole, the CEO whose company had just acquired the very laboratory holding the technology capable of cornering Whitman Industrial with no escape. Madison opened her ultralight laptop, her fingers trembling, not from fear but from the surge of adrenaline rolling through her like a storm. The screen's glow washed across her face, erasing all traces of fatigue from the confrontation earlier. Daniel had sent her documents, but Madison needed to review everything herself, to trace every thread. The internal report spelled it out clearly. North Haven, a town with an abnormally high cancer rate. Water contaminated. PFAS, the forever chemicals, unbreakable, seeping into human blood, causing miscarriages, infertility, heart disease, cancer. Each line struck her like a needle. She remembered the eyes of a woman who had spoken at a community hearing the previous year. Voice trembling. "We just want clean water for our children." Is that too much to ask? Madison clenched her hand, a tightness rising in her chest. No, it was not too much. What was too much was that children had grown up drinking poisoned water without knowing it, while corporations profited in silence. Her phone buzzed. A message from Daniel appeared. "Madison, I think this is bigger than we realized. I am checking further." She typed back, "I need you to help me strike first." Less than half a minute later, Daniel called. Madison put on her headset, her voice dropping low, her gaze fixed on the night sky, as though she were speaking directly to the darkness. "Daniel, I want Pierce protected the moment he lands. A private security team. No one gets near him first." Daniel hesitated for a single beat. "You think the danger is that serious?" Madison closed her eyes. Gerald's words replayed in her mind. "Someone like you, I will not move for you, I will sue you." But underneath that arrogance was the panic of a man who already sensed defeat closing in. She answered slowly, "A man who is losing his career, his freedom and his reputation, will do anything to save himself. And we have no idea if he has allies." Daniel exhaled sharply. "Understood, I will arrange it." She continued, "I want to file a restraining order. preventing Gerald from approaching any witnesses. "And I want it signed before we land," Daniel replied. "We have more than enough legal grounds." Then, with the voice of someone who had stared down toxic corporations before, he added, "He has turned himself into living proof that he is capable of threatening others. The video will help us greatly." The video? Madison opened Liam's email again. She replayed the moment. Gerald shouted, "I will not follow anyone. I want to see what you dare do to me. And the most damning line, someone like you does not deserve to be here." Madison felt no personal pain from his words. She had heard versions of them for 10, 20, even 30 years. What hurt was knowing that people like Gerald were not individual anomalies. They were a system, a structure, a rotten power culture that suffocated the very communities poisoned at the bottom of society. That video was not just evidence of Gerald insulting her, it was evidence of his desperation. And desperate men make the most mistakes. "Daniel," she said, her voice sharpening like metal cooling into a blade. "We are going public with this video." Daniel responded instantly. "That will cause a media storm." "Exactly," Madison answered. "I want to take away their advantage." After ending the call, Madison leaned back and stared at the ceiling, the hum of the engines pounding like the drumbeat of a counter-strike forming in real time. But then a thought shot through her like an electric spark. Gerald was out of the game. But what about those above him? Whitman Industrial was not a one-man operation. They had a board. They had lawyers. They had political ties. They had people willing to bury the truth by any means necessary. If Gerald failed, would they send someone else? Someone more skilled? Someone more desperate? Madison opened her browser and searched for the CEO of Whitman Industrial. Thomas Whitman, Gerald's older brother. A face carved from stone. A record built on political leverage and ruthless litigation. A man like that would never allow his empire to fall without fighting until his final breath. Madison exhaled sharply, wiping her forehead even though the cabin was cool. This was no longer a legal battle, no longer a scientific one. This was the survival war of a collapsing empire, and collapsing empires were the most dangerous of all. She smiled faintly, a smile carved from resolve. "Then let us fight." The cabin lights dimmed into night mode, but Madison's eyes did not. The fire in them burned even brighter, as if she could already see the enemy's next moves unfolding beneath the darkness. She sent one final message to Daniel. "Prepare everything. When I land in Zurich, the game will change." As she lowered her phone, the steady rumble of the engines blended with her thoughts, creating the soundtrack to a war about to begin high above the world. From seat 2A, Madison gazed out the window. The sky was too calm, too still, but she knew that beneath those clouds a battle was waiting. And she, the woman who only wanted to sit in the seat she had paid for, had now become the center of a global confrontation. The irony was almost poetic. Gerald thought he was sabotaging her journey. But he was the one who helped her see the real enemy. And this war Madison would not lose. Not even an inch. As the plane moved deeper into Atlantic airspace, the sky outside turned into a vast sheet of midnight silk, dotted with stars like unanswered questions waiting to be written. The cabin drifted into a half-waking, half-dreaming, quiet reading lights, casting soft golden halos over resting faces. But in seat 2, a Madison Cole was wide awake. She had entered the state of a thinking predator, silent, focused, and waiting for the exact moment to deliver a decisive strike. The incident with Gerald had not shaken her. It had awakened something powerful inside her. something only those who have battled the darkness long enough can recognize the instinct that fate had just placed in her hands, a mission larger and more consequential than she had imagined, and one she needed the courage to meet. Madison curled her fingers slightly, feeling the cold traveling down her hand, not the cold of fear, but the cold of sharpened clarity. The subtle vibrations of the aircraft felt like the entire fuselage was aligning itself with her as she stepped into an unnamed war. She opened Liam's video again. Gerald stood there, face burning red like an emergency beacon, every word spilling from him like toxic waste, leaking from an unchecked plant. The contempt in his voice, the contempt aimed at her, aimed at anyone he deemed beneath him, only highlighted the desperation drowning him. This video was the kind of weapon any lawyer dreamed of having. But Madison was not thinking only about the lawsuit. She was thinking of the families in North Haven, the people who had spent years drinking poisoned water. She thought of the children exposed to PFAS from the day they were born. She thought of the mothers who cried without understanding why their children were sick. Gerald represented a power structure that had treated their lives as nothing more than margin loss on a quarterly spreadsheet. And now his own words would become the metallic shard reflecting the truth he was trying so hard to bury. Madison forwarded the video to Daniel with a message. "Keep the original. The copy is for me to use." Daniel replied immediately, "What are you planning?" Madison smiled faintly. "What needs to be done?" She turned off the screen and allowed her mind a rare few seconds of rest. But then, from the row behind her, a soft voice appeared, the voice of Liam Foster, the young intern who had recorded everything. Dr. Cole Madison looked back to see the young man standing uncertainly, hand gripping the seatback eyes, full of respect and worry. He looked at her, the way someone might look at a hero they never expected to meet. I just wanted to make sure you are all right. I saw what happened and I could not stay silent." Madison studied him for a moment. His eyes were not like those who sought fame or credit. They were clear, sincere, carrying that rare quality she respected deeply in the younger generation, the instinct to stand up when something is wrong. "Thank you, Liam," she said. "Your courage will help far more than you realize." Liam blushed, nodded and returned to his seat like someone who had just been entrusted with something far greater than he knew. And in that moment, Madison understood something important. Sometimes justice begins with one ordinary person deciding not to look away. She turned back to her seat and exhaled. The softness lasted no more than 5 seconds before strategy surged back through her mind, like a glowing map in the dark. She opened her contacts and scrolled to one of the most influential journalists in environmental reporting, Rebecca Hall, the investigative reporter from Earthwatch Global, the woman who had taken down 3 chemical corporations and won 2 Pulitzer Prizes. Madison sent the video with a single line. "Rebecca, this will wake the world. Full confidentiality. Send." Madison knew Rebecca would watch it regardless of the time zone. And when she did, she would understand. The plane cut through the night, and the sensation of movement made Madison feel like she was crossing an invisible border, the border between reacting and launching an offensive. Gerald might have left the aircraft, but the fight against the system that shaped him was only at its prologue. Madison closed her eyes, though she did not sleep. Her mind drifted back to the night she first read the North Haven report, alone in her office. She remembered a story of a 6-year-old child asking Mum, "Why does the water hurt my stomach?" She remembered the way she pressed her hand into the report until the paper left marks on her skin. She had made a promise to herself, then a promise she refused to break, that she would never allow any corporation to prosper by destroying the innocent. And now fate had placed her in a battle she could not afford to lose. As the cabin lights dimmed completely and the wind whispered past the window like the breath of the midnight ocean, Madison felt more certain than ever that this war was not just the responsibility of a CEO. It was the mission of a human being who had known enough pain to understand the value of truth. She opened her eyes just as her phone vibrated. An email from Rebecca Hall. One line, I watched it. This will be a bombshell. Madison tightened her hand, feeling every heartbeat pulse like a war drum. The battle was no longer a possibility. It had begun. And then, as if to confirm it, another message lit up the screen, this one from Daniel. Madison, I just received word. Whitman Industrial has called an emergency board meeting tonight. Madison's body went cold for 2 seconds, then burned with the fire only quiet warriors carry. They know, she whispered. They are afraid. And when an empire begins to fear, it begins to expose its cracks. Madison opened her laptop again, eyes sharpening. Good, she murmured. Let us see who survives. The plane soared through the night, but in seat 2A, the first outline of a dawn of justice was beginning to form. Because Madison knew better than anyone, the cost of silence was the suffering of an entire community, and the cost of truth was simply the courage of one woman refusing to yield her seat to a man who believed he could take it without consequence. But tonight, he and all those he served were the ones who should tremble. As the first rays of dawn spilled through the small airplane window and brushed against Madison's cheek, she opened her eyes with a strange sensation, not the usual relief after a long flight, but the awareness that the battlefield had shifted beneath her feet. The plane descended, and Zurich unfolded below her like a map of a world waiting to be reshaped. In the distance lay the still waters of Lake Zurich, and closer in were streets so clean they seemed almost unreal. But Madison knew well that such peacefulness did not apply to the war she was about to enter. When the plane touched down, the friction of the wheels against the runway sounded like the opening drumbeat of a massive chess match. The moment she turned her phone on, a storm of notifications crashed in. At the top was a message from Rebecca. The video has spread, faster than I expected. Madison opened the link. The footage of Gerald screaming in the cabin had already reached more than 2 million views within a few hours. Thousands of furious comments, hundreds of analysis posts, hashtags condemning discrimination and abuse of power, and even discussions linking the incident to the PFAS lawsuit were already spreading. But the most striking part was not the speed of the video's spread, but the direction. Viewers were not only angry that Gerald insulted a woman of color, they were asking if a vice president of a chemical corporation behaves like this. What else are they hiding? A small confrontation in a first-class cabin had erupted into a firestorm of public scrutiny that Whitman Industrial could no longer control. Madison inhaled deeply. The storm had formed, but she needed one more weapon to steer it. The next notification came from Daniel Urgent. The court has signed the restraining order. Gerald cannot go near Pierce. We have won the first move. A sharp current pulsed through Madison's chest. Now, whatever Whitman Industrial planned to do to stop Aaron Pierce, they would have to face the law, the press, and global public attention to attempt it. When she stepped off the plane, 2 special security officers in black suits were already waiting in the jet bridge. One of them, tall and solidly built, nodded respectfully. "Welcome to Zurich, Dr. Cole. We have been assigned to escort you." Madison nodded. "And Pierce?" "He has arrived at the hotel safely under 24-hour protection," the officer replied. However, he glanced at his partner, tension flickering across his face. "We detected 2 unknown individuals trying to track his movements at Geneva Airport. They did not identify themselves as belonging to any official agency." Madison stopped mid-stride, her breath slowing as she recognized a new piece snapping into place. If they dared follow him, that meant Whitman Industrial was truly desperate. Desperate enough to make mistakes. She spoke low but firm. "Every movement Pierce makes must be completely concealed. No schedules, no public appearances, no unknown contact." Understood. As her car left the airport, Zurich's pristine streets slid past the windows, beautiful and orderly, but Madison did not see beauty. She saw nodes on the battlefield, glowing in her mind. She now had the video, the court order, the witness, the media, the fury of the public. Now she needed the final strike turning truth into something irreversible. When she arrived at the hotel, another alert lit up her screen. Breaking news. Whitman Industrial holds emergency press conference in Ohio. Madison opened the live stream. On stage, CEO Thomas Whitman stood in front of a barrage of camera flashes. He attempted to appear calm, but the veins at his temples told the real story. He proclaimed that Gerald was an individual, acting improperly, not representative of company values. He tried to sever the corporation from the scandal. Every word sounded carefully engineered to dissolve public anger by polishing the language. But then a reporter stood up. "Mr. Whitman, is it true your company is facing new scientific evidence that may prove Whitman Industrial contaminated North Haven's water for many decades?" Thomas froze for half a second, but that was all Madison needed to see his fear. Another reporter asked, "We received information that an engineer from GeoWave Analytics is preparing to present that evidence at the climate summit. Is your company attempting to stop that from happening?" Thomas Whitman visibly paled before millions watching live. Madison smiled faintly. No more saving face. No more hiding. The fire was spreading, not because she fed it, but because they had allowed the leak for decades. When she reached her hotel suite, Aaron Pierce was already waiting with 2 security officers. He looked exhausted, but his eyes lit up when he saw her. "Madison, I heard about what happened on your flight. Are you all right?" "I am fine," she replied. "What matters is that you are safe." Aaron opened his laptop and pulled out a thick folder. "Madison, the final results are ready. The isotope data, comparative samples, error charts, everything matches perfectly. North Haven was poisoned by Whitman Industrial's plant. There is nothing left for them to deny." A cold rush moved through Madison's body, not fear, but awe at the weight of the truth. A single sheet of paper, a single number, a single plotted line could change thousands of lives. She whispered, "Finally." But Aaron did not smile. He spoke seriously. "Madison, I think they will try to stop us. Never underestimate them. A corporation with money and political influence will do anything to survive." Madison met his gaze, her voice forged in steel. "Then we have to be faster. And more public." She picked up her phone and called Daniel. "I want this scientific report sent to all 3 major international newsrooms before the climate summit session begins, and send a copy to the Ohio Attorney General's office." Daniel paused for 3 seconds. "Madison, that is the killing blow. Exactly," she said. and it has to happen now." When she ended the call, sunlight streamed across her face, outlining her features in a golden edge, like the halo of a warrior emerging from the shadows. Outside her window, Zurich was impossibly calm, but Madison knew that within hours the world would erupt with the truth she held in her hands, and the Whitman Empire had just begun its countdown. As the doors of the World Climate Summit's main hall opened, dozens of cameras immediately swung toward Madison, as if they could sense the epicenter of the coming quake walking into the room. Reporters' voices rose in a chaotic symphony. Heels struck the marble floor like rapid percussion, and questions shot through the air like arrows released from drawn bows. But Madison did not hesitate for even half a step. Her eyes were sharp, her breath steady, her stride straight and unbroken, a silent declaration that she was not here to speak. She was here to rewrite a chapter of history. The grand auditorium glowed under clean white light as she walked to the podium. Below her, delegates from hundreds of nations, environmental experts, scientists, and international journalists watched with attention built from anticipation. But beneath those layers of attention was the one thing Madison felt most clearly: the world was waiting for the truth. She began in a calm voice, but each word carried the weight of iron. Our future does not lie in technology. It does not lie in numbers printed on a report. It lies in integrity. The entire hall leaned toward her. Madison lifted her hand and opened the first slide the PFAS isotopic analysis Aaron Pierce had painstakingly completed. "This is the truth," she said. "Not from testimony, not from speculation, but from science. A truth that cannot be distorted." On the screen, the comparison chart came into full view. The chemical signature in the North Haven water matched perfectly with waste from Whitman Industrial's plant. A swell of whispers spread through the hall like waves crashing to shore. Delegates bent toward each other, analyzing, debating, stunned. Cameras zoomed in on the slide, capturing every number as though they were shouting in the language of justice. Madison continued her voice, gaining force. "Whitman Industrial has poisoned North Haven for many decades. Thousands have paid the price with their health, their lifespan, and the future of their children." Her eyes burned with a quiet, searing anger, and they tried to hide this. At the back of the hall, a reporter stood. "Is there any evidence that the company attempted to obstruct the release of these findings?" Madison looked calmly into the forest of cameras, and then smiled a smile that drained the entire room of sound. "Yes." She opened the second slide. The image of Gerald Whitman screaming at her on the plane filled the massive LED screen. The hall erupted in gasps. Shocked breaths echoed in every direction. There was Gerald's face contorted with rage, shouting discriminatory insults, refusing to follow safety instructions, endangering hundreds of passengers. Madison spoke slowly, each word deliberate. "This is the Vice President of Operations at Whitman Industrial. This is how he reacted when he realized that I, the CEO, holding the scientific evidence, was on the same flight." No one spoke. No one dared. Madison stepped forward, her voice dropping into a tone that seemed to pull the entire world closer. "A person facing the truth does not fear it. Only those who know they are guilty behave like this." Cameras swung toward the press section. Some journalists covered their mouths in disbelief. Others typed so fast their keyboards shook. Madison ended her speech with a line that millions would later repeat. "Justice is not a grand war. Justice begins the moment you say no to what is wrong, even if the wrong is sitting right beside you." Applause exploded through the hall like thunder. crashing against every stone pillar, every flag, every face. It was not applause for a speaker. It was applause for release, for fury, for truth finally unleashed. Madison stepped down from the podium without looking back. She did not need to. She knew she had delivered the final blow, the decisive strike against a toxic empire. And in that exact moment, her phone vibrated. A message from Daniel appeared. Whitman Industrial's assets have just been frozen by the court. Their stock is in free fall. The board is in emergency session. A second message. And Gerald has been formally charged with obstructing aviation safety. Madison tightened her grip on the phone, feeling as though the unnamed souls of North Haven were finally able to breathe. She said nothing. She did not have to, because from the moment she stepped out of that hall, the world understood one thing: justice had found its path, and it began with a seat. As Madison stepped out of the conference center, the late afternoon light over Zurich seemed to take on a new clarity, brighter, deeper, as if the city itself had exhaled after the truth was finally brought into the open. Reporters rushed toward her microphones, pressed forward questions flying with the urgency of arrows loosed from a bow. But Madison only offered a calm smile and said, "This story is not about me. It belongs to North Haven." And then, as she entered the car, waiting outside, and the door closed behind her, sealing her into a rare pocket of quiet after hours of upheaval, Madison finally allowed herself a long breath, the breath of a warrior who had nearly finished a battle, but had not yet laid down her weapons. Her phone buzzed again, a message from Daniel, brief but heavy as iron dropping into her chest. Whitman Industrial has just filed for bankruptcy protection. The court has appointed a trustee. Their assets will be liquidated to create the North Haven Compensation Fund. Madison set the phone on her lap, her hand trembling slightly. Not from victory, but from what that victory meant. Thousands of families, thousands of sick individuals, thousands of shattered dreams would finally have a measure of hope. She looked out the window, watching Lake Zurich glow beneath the evening sun, like a vast mirror reflecting the universe's quiet honesty, a reminder that light will come, even if it must cut through the darkest layers first. But the journey was not yet complete. When her car stopped at the hotel security staff, immediately opened the door for her. As she stepped inside the lobby, she saw Aaron Pierce waiting a stack of documents in his arms, his face weary, but his eyes burning with purpose. "It is over," he said, voice trembling with relief. Madison shook her head. "No, this is only the beginning for them." She gestured for him to follow her to the private meeting room, where representatives of North Haven, those who had flown all this way to fight for their community, were waiting. When Madison entered the room and the door closed behind her, the silence felt charged with the weight of countless unheard voices. An older woman stood her face, marked by time and pain. "Ms. Cole, thank you." We never thought her voice cracked. Madison stepped forward and took the woman's hands, firmly offering a promise, without needing to shape it into words. "You are the ones who never gave up. I was just the one who opened the door." Tears streamed down the woman's cheeks. Not the tears of weakness, but the tears of someone who had carried too much suffering and had finally glimpsed a sliver of light. And in that room, Madison felt the truest reason for her fight, not to win, but to heal. That feeling settled deeper into her chest when she received an envelope from the court-appointed trustee. Inside was the certificate establishing the North Haven Restoration Fund, created jointly by Redwood and the community, funded by billions of dollars from the liquidation of Whitman Industrial. A new legacy born from the collapse of a toxic empire. After the meeting, Madison returned to her temporary office in the hotel and stood before the tall windows, looking down at the city washed in fading daylight. She realized that the path leading her here had not begun with research or reports or tense boardroom discussions. It began the moment she stood before seat 2A and chose not to step aside. A small decision. A simple moment. But like the flap of a butterfly's wing in a storm, it set off a chain reaction that led to justice for an entire community. Her phone vibrated softly. A message from an unlisted number. Madison, thank you for standing up. Thank you for not letting him take your seat. We in North Haven will never forget. Madison smiled gently and placed a hand over her heart. She thought of Gerald, a man who once believed a seat defined his power. But true power was never in claiming a place. It was in standing tall before injustice and saying enough. The Zurich sunset stretched across the sky, and in that golden light, Madison Cole, the woman who boarded a plane as a CEO but walked out as a symbol of integrity, understood that she had not won for today alone. She had planted a seed of truth, a seed of justice, and that legacy would continue to bloom long after this storm had passed. From the perspective of an expert in leadership ethics and the mechanics of power, Madison Cole's story reveals a truth many people often forget. Justice does not begin in grand courtrooms. It begins in the moment an ordinary individual chooses to stand firm in front of what is wrong. A first-class seat that seemed meaningless became the spark that exposed an entire web of deception, because sometimes change does not come from force, it comes from dignity fiercely protected. Madison did not prevail because she was the most powerful. She prevailed because she was the one person who refused to be silent. If this story inspires you, tap like to help spread the message of integrity and resolve. Do not forget to subscribe so you can follow the next journeys toward justice. And before you leave, comment the phrase "stand firm" to remind one another that sometimes a single moment of courage is enough to shift the world.